unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. We have 2 more episodes to go in this, our 11th season of Grand Tamasha. What better way to spend an hour than with our Grand Tamasha News Roundup regulars, Sadanand Dhume of the Wall Street Journal and AEI. Sadanand, welcome.
Good to be back.
And Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Hello, Tanvi.
Hey, Milan. It's been a while.
Today, we are going to talk about one issue and one issue alone, which is the 2024 Indian general elections and their aftermath. We're going to discuss the politics, as well as the economic and foreign policy implications of the result. But let's start with the politics, which seems like an obvious place to start. It's been about 2 weeks since the surprising verdict in the 2024 elections. Sadanand, let me begin with you. I think at this point, we've reached sort of peak election. We've read 1 million op-eds, seen a lot of television interviews, probably talked to everyone and their mother that we could get a hold of about the elections. As you sit and reflect, 2 weeks on, are you able to kind of take away a central message from what has gone down in India?
Yeah, I'd say I'd take a couple, and they're both interrelated. The first and the most obvious is the fact that anti-incumbency as a phenomenon in Indian politics is not over. Even though Prime Minister Modi has come back and he's won a 3rd successive term, he's come back with fewer seats. The BJP no longer has a single party majority. And the idea that he was somehow this political figure who could magically keep winning elections with larger and larger mandates every time, that is obviously not the case. It has brought him down to earth in that sense, right? All the talk about being divinely sent and divinely guided, notwithstanding. So that's, I think. And the second, the obverse of that is that the Indian opposition is not dead. It may be wounded, but it is certainly not dead. And those of us who had written them off, including myself after the exit polls, I think, this has sort of certainly shown that was not the case.
So let me just stick with you for a second and ask you about your favorite subject after demonetization, which is Rahul Gandhi. I want to ask you a question about, how much credit he deserves, because, there's some people who say, well, yes, it's true, Congress had its 3rd worst performance ever, but it doubled its seat tally compared to 2019. Rahul Gandhi contested 2 seats, Wayanad in Kerala and Raebareli in UP, and won both of them. His yatra, two of his yatras, right? He had 2 legs, seems to have boosted the party organization. Do we need to revise our views on Rahul?
So let's just say that, let's say he was stock, right? You'd undoubtedly point out that this stock is doing well right now, and it has doubled its value in the last few weeks. But if you look at the long-term trend, has it been a great investment? Has it been offered great returns over the last 10 years? And the answer is no. So I guess, you have to sort of separate the short term to the long term. To his credit, I will say that, Rahul Gandhi has, substantively, he has made clear gains, not just in terms of the seats he won, but I think that the Bharat Jodo Yatra and then the second one, the two big yatras or walkathons that he did across the length and breadth of the country, they do seem to have impacted his image in a positive way. I used to always sort of point out quite facetiously that like kind of a baseline level for Rahul Gandhi was like, can he kind of figure out how he wants to look? And can he actually spend 6 months in India without rushing off to some other place on a vacation? Like 2 sort of base. And I think both of those have been addressed, right? He's figured out that he has to wear this white t-shirt and have a beard. And that's the Rahul Gandhi look. He doesn't jet off to places unknown quite as often, or didn't seem to this time immediately after the election. So at a baseline, he's done that. The third criticism, which I think was valid, was that he was just not a good public speaker, but quite a mediocre public speaker. But if you watch some of his recent speeches, again, there's been a learning and there's been an improvement. So there's no doubt that Rahul Gandhi, particularly coming off of these 2 twin victories in Raebareli and Wayanad, his stock is up, no doubt about that. Whether this person has, fundamentally managed to transform himself and transform his party in a way that they're going to be viable contenders for power in 2029, I think it's still too early to say. But for now, I do think that critics, including people like myself, do have to go back and reassess some of our priors.
I mean, I would just highlight that there are kind of two interesting things to watch out for. I mean, one, we heard today as we're recording that Rahul Gandhi's sister, Priyanka Gandhi, is going to stand for the seat that he's giving up in Wayanad, which will be her maiden voyage into direct electoral politics as a candidate. And the second thing we're still waiting to hear is who will be the leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha. And there are a lot of people who are putting Rahul Gandhi's name forward. There are other names, too, from the Congress side, but his is certainly the most prominent one. Tanvi, let me ask you now about the flip side, which is the BJP. Needless to say, since this result has come out, we've seen some interesting dynamics at work. We had the RSS chief, Mohan Bhagwat. He had a not very veiled speech in which he criticized various things about the campaign, including the quote-unquote decorum of politics, the arrogance of the campaign, which seemed to be pointing the finger at the way the BJP prosecuted its case. Earlier in the campaign, we saw the sort of reverse. We saw the BJP president, J.P. Nadda, question the role that the RSS actually plays on the ground, saying, they really mattered when we were a small party, but now we're a big party, and they're not so significant. As you think about the BJP side, does any of this tell us about where they might have gone astray?
I think those two things tell me that there are kind of frictions within the Sangh Parivar writ large. I think it also tells me that the RSS wants it known, or wants the narrative to set in, that they are indispensable and they cannot be taken for granted. Now, whether that is true or not, I think as there's an assessment of why there were losses where there were, but also why the BJP did win the seats they did win. I mean, we focus often on the losses for understandable reasons, but those assessments within the party, and one thing we know about the party is it does do these lessons learned exercises, is that I think will tell us a bit more about how the dynamics unfold and how much kind of the RSS BJP dynamics. And it's not, these frictions aren't new. We've known that Prime Minister Modi, when he was Chief Minister, Modi also had these frictions with it in Gujarat with the RSS. But how much these frictions, or even if not frictions, the dynamics between the RSS and BJP and different people within the BJP, how did these affect turnout? How did they affect, kind of party worker enthusiasm? What they did in terms of candidate selection? I think we'll find all these, or we think we'll find things out. One of the things I'm watching is, as analysts, we sit and we have assessments of wins and losses. But to me, almost equally, if not more important, is why does a party think that they won and lost? And, if you go back to the 2004 election that came up again quite often in analysis in the last couple of weeks, data shows very different reasons that the BJP or the NDA coalition didn't get reelected that time. But it seemed to have set in the assessment of the BJP then was that they lost because India Shining didn't work and they needed to be more cautious about economic reforms. So to me, the question isn't, what I think or what these statements is. What does the BJP itself think about these results, and what dynamics it sets off, not just kind of with the BJP and the opposition or parliament functioning, but does it set off certain dynamics within the BJP and the Sangh Parivar writ large? So,
Sadanand, let me just kind of bring this point to you a little bit. You follow kind of what the Indian right wing does very closely. What do you think some of the lessons they're learning are, right? I mean, was this a campaign that went too far or didn't go far enough insofar as Hindutva is concerned? What do you think they're gleaning from all of this?
I mean, the problem with so much of this kind of, post-election analysis is that invariably people sort of come, they decide that the reason that the party did badly was that they happened to neglect their one pet peeve or pet demand of the person doing the analysis. And you're seeing a lot of that in the Hindu right? In fact, it's quite incredible, right? Because mainstream analysis would basically suggest that Modi speaking too aggressively against Muslims and some of the sort of language rhetoric he used in the campaign backfired. In fact, he lost several of the seats where he made some of the most controversial speeches during this campaign. But there's a whole section of the Hindu right which is mad at Modi because they think he was too nice to Muslims, for example. So, I mean, the whole thing is just, it's all over the map. You have people sort of, arguing that he was, bent over backwards to get the Dalit vote and it didn't work out. And there are other people arguing the opposite, that, he could not reassure the Dalit vote and therefore. So there isn't, it certainly is not unified. There is a lot of mutual recrimination going on. It's kind of interesting to see. And there's a lot of finger pointing going on too.
I want to ask you both, and maybe Tanvi, I'll start with you, about what this says about Indian democracy, right? Because you have some people who have argued very vocally that, this goes to show you that all of this talk that comes out of think tanks and places like Carnegie and Brookings about democratic backsliding is all bunkum, right? There's no validity to it. Other people saying that we were at the abyss and we peered over and we stepped back, right? And what we're seeing now is a kind of rebirth of democracy in India. And I'm wondering, as you've sat and reflected, what do you think these elections say about the vitality of Indian democracy?
I mean, I think, on the one hand, it follows on something Sadanand just said, which is in this election, its results can tell you whatever point or, whatever your priors were, it proves that point. So those people who think, that Indian democracy is dead and flailing, etc., they will say that, look, this is despite everything. Others who say that, there was nothing wrong with it in the first place are saying, see, you guys were all writing reports and, I haven't made the grand conspiracy theory charts, Milan, unlike other people on this podcast. But I think people are picking and choosing. I think you can say that, on the one hand, Prime Minister Modi was clearly prescient in Washington a year ago when he said democracy is in Indians' DNA, that their vote still matters. But I do think, when others point out that there have been issues with the checks and balances in terms of institutions, in terms of the role of the media, that the media played, still questions the fact that people are questioning an institution, sometimes over questioning an institution in ways that we haven't seen before, like the Election Commission. It's clear that, I mean, it's not just kind of imagined. So I think, Indian democracy is more robust than its kind of critics or kind of pessimists said, and it's not potentially as robust as it's the kind of optimists and naysayers have said either.
Sadanand?
I mean, Mil, very quickly on this. So, there are basically two different conversations going on, right? There's a conversation among, scholars of democracy, people like you, and they're looking at, they mean something very specific, right? When you're talking about democratic backsliding, you're talking about too much power being concentrated with the executive and institutions that are meant to check that power, and independent media, judiciary, and so on, having their powers curtailed. And I think that was a very real problem, and I don't think that has really gone away. Though it remains to be seen how the BJP will behave with 240 seats compared to how it behaved with 303. But I think in the popular imagination, it's just a completely different story, right? And so they basically equate democracy with elections. And there, I think there's going to be even less patience if it's possible for those of us who point out the more kind of the subtler aspects of democratic backsliding. For them, it's a very simple, straightforward argument. Look, the EVMs worked. BJP lost 63 seats. Congress did much better than before. Stop making noises about Indian democracy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And I do think that argument is certainly going to be strengthened among that section of society.
I think, though, it's worth saying that, I'm not a political scientist who focuses on domestic politics, but I'll just from the kind of perhaps geopolitical angle that I often look at the world, which is it is hard not to think about kind of the US-China context in different ways. We sometimes say, but it's only electoral democracy. And I do think Indian voters have shown how India is so different from another Asian giant next door. And I think, the fact that we take it for granted sometimes. And the US angle being that, while in some ways you can see the liberal aspects are more prominent here, sometimes on the electoral democracy side, we don't do that great. So I think, these are the kind of clearly both the signals that democracy is a work in progress there and here, and that it is going to be a constant effort in India in terms of voters turning out and showing their faith in the ballot box. But also for me, at the end of the day, this is my kind of non-academic side, is, as a kind of a believer in democracy, that an electoral democracy too, that we take it for granted. But, the fact that so many countries do not have that, including China right next door to India, means this is still important. So I wouldn't want to suggest that we're somehow downplaying the significance of the election as well.
I mean, I'll just say one last thing before we move on to foreign policy, which is it is interesting to me, and this comes out in some of the survey data from CSDS Lokaniti, the degree to which the trust and faith in the election commission has declined, right? And this is discernible. If you look at that question and how it's been asked over the past 3 election cycles, you see a steady decline. I was talking to some friends who had been traveling in the field, including in Uttar Pradesh, and even among BJP supporters, a lot of people had questions about the sanctity of EVMs, for instance, right? So whether we like it or not, and whether there's actually a problem of fraud, I think most of us think there is not, at least we haven't seen the proof in terms of, ballot harvesting and so on and so forth. There is a perception there that that could be problematic if this continues, and I think many people were dismayed by the tone and tenor of the ECI, which it didn't necessarily kind of instill confidence in people. But I do think that's something in the long term that has to be thought about. Tanvi, let me. You kind of went into foreign policy with the U.S.-China analogy, so why don't we just go there right away and ask you about how this result has gone down in foreign capitals, because I could imagine one of two responses, right? On the one hand, you think officials in Washington or Brussels or London or wherever might say, oh, this is good. We have the Modi government in place, but they've been kind of taken down a peg, right? So that kind of brashness, arrogance, confidence is sort of, diminished. On the other hand, I think there could be people who are genuinely worried about policy paralysis and gridlock and inability to push through reforms and so on and so forth. So on balance, right, as you think about how global capitals are responding, which instinct do you think are they following?
I think it depends on which capitals, and I think in Western capitals, we've seen that on the one hand, there's kind of a bit of a business as usual approach, and we saw this at the G7 outreach meeting, which Prime Minister Modi attended, and even kind of incoming visits, and you saw the number of leaders who were congratulating him and his response, and I think that's also partly the Prime Minister's responses. I think was also trying to convey that it's business as usual. So I do think on the one hand, the business as usual from foreign capitals is partly because the structural factors that have made India important for them, whether that's geopolitical or economic, remains. And I think sometimes, one gets caught up in individuals, but this investment that countries are making is the geopolitical, the kind of economic investment is in India, the strategic investment. And so I think that those kind of realities and factors persist for the time being. I do think, on the other hand, you have seen in Western capitals questions about what a return to coalition governments in the real form, as in the BJP needing a coalition, not just, having one. What does that mean for politics, for policy? And I think, yes, they're looking at some of the internal dynamics. What does this mean for internal dynamics? But I think the things that people are looking for particularly tend to be on foreign economic policy. What does this mean for reform and the implications? What does this mean for potentially for the policies in terms of semiconductors, defense policy, etc. that this means? So I do think you've seen some questions, some thinking about, do adaptations need to be made to this kind of new reality? The other kind of intangible, which I don't think we'll know, but as both of you alluded to, there's a sense that the prime minister, while still and his party, while still dominant, aren't invincible, aren't inevitable, aren't kind of that. They might be dominant, but they're not the kind of the kind of unipolar hegemon in the way that they were. And what does that do to how fellow leaders think about him and approach him? I think that's the intangible. At the end of the day, they're all politicians. When he was winning big, I think it meant something. I think it's still impressive to people. This is a third-time prime minister. It hasn't happened, but I do think that is something we don't know yet. But I think much will depend on what he does now in terms of policy and politics. In terms of how, I'll just briefly say, I think, it was very interesting. We saw Russia and President Putin come out very quickly to congratulate him, ahead of kind of when protocol. And I think, very much trying to convey that, look, everybody else is waiting for protocol. I won. So, to me, part of it is, I wonder how it went down that, then you had Prime Minister Modi hugging Ukrainian President Zelensky, a video that disappeared from certain media feeds. But nonetheless, it's I think for Russia again, it's the country that's important, and would like to see India continue to support it. To me, the most interesting country is China, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But how one thing I'll note: Xi Jinping has still not congratulated Modi. The Chinese premier has. But unlike last time when Xi Jinping in 2019 came out pretty quickly to congratulate Modi, we have not seen a congratulations from Xi Jinping yet.
I love how, as an aside,
so Sadanand has had a sly smile this whole time.
I just love how Tanvi brings this international relations lens to her description of domestic politics. I'm pretty sure no one has ever described Modi as a unipolar hegemon before. So I just wanted to point that out.
Speaking of unipolar hegemons or former unipolar hegemons, let me ask you, Sadanand, about the United States. We've seen some pretty interesting revelations in this, crazy murder for hire plot. Nikhil Gupta, who was the alleged sort of interlocutor hitman in the Panun case, has been extradited to the United States. Happened just before the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan showed up in New Delhi. Simultaneously, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, has come out with a lengthy look at the so-called den of Indian spies that was uncovered in Australia by their intelligence services. Just an assessment about where you think this takes us. Is this some kind of ticking time bomb that could really do destruction? Or do you think it's likely to be kind of smothered and diffused before it really causes much distress?
Yeah, I mean, I think the technical term for this is complete clusterfuck, right?
Can we say that on a family program? We'll have to check that.
You could beep it out. But look, it's at a couple of different levels, right? I mean, there's this particular plot itself, right? And it's got this, crazy cast of characters, and it's I hope Netflix has optioned the story already. And on that, I do think that there are a couple of things. First of all, there's mutual incomprehension that I still see, right? If you talk to Americans and people in the U.S. government, they can't believe this. They're like, well, what were these people thinking? How could you even sort of conceive of, if the allegations are true, how could you even conceive of, it's a friendly government attempting to murder an American citizen on American soil, right? It's just like it's just so hard to wrap their heads around. And on the Indian side, people are incredulous too, which is that why on earth would anyone allow a relationship of such geopolitical significance to be undermined by, one crazy dude. Like, who cares? And I think that there's that sort of, there's a bit of talking past each other. I think on the immediate issue, what we've seen so far is that both sides have shown both the will and the sophistication to isolate this and keep the relationship moving, right? It's not a coincidence that Jake Sullivan was there, the ISET announcement was made, and so on. But I think that the part that worries me more is not this particular case, but how it represents the tip of the iceberg. And I think that is where there has to be sort of, I think more scrutiny or a deeper conversation, which is that what exactly has this government done, and what exactly has the rhetoric of some of its supporters done in terms of maybe not reviving the Khalistan movement. That would be an exaggeration. I don't think it's been revived, but in kind of stoking sick fears and resentments. And that, I think, is a real problem. And that is the bigger thing to worry about, I think, compared to like this, this particular thing, which is this particular allegation or plot that has, consumed so much of our newsprint and airtime.
I do think, just to that broader point of what impact this has, I do think some of it depends on, and by the way, I agree with Sadanand on the revival of, Khalistan as a kind of a idea amongst the diaspora, and the complications it will set up for India on the foreign policy side. My broader issue is, I think it depends on what lessons are learned from this incident. And Sadanand's right, this has been managed by both countries because both countries consider the relationship important. And not just the US and India. Obviously, this is, Canada, UK, Australia, and especially UK and Australia. I think this has been managed with them in India in as good a fashion as could be managed given the implications. I think the lessons learned part is if there's an understanding that this should not happen again, then I think this will be managed. I think if, on the other hand, some of the kind of triumphalism we're seeing, at least on social media, and I think if anything, this election was a reminder that social media isn't reality sometimes. But nonetheless, if some of this triumphalism prevails within the establishment too, that India is so important that it can do whatever it wants around the world and nobody will push back, I think that then we will be headed in for more tensions in the future that will not play out the same way in terms of managing these differences. I think on the other hand, and so I think that I hope the right lessons, to the extent that they are to be learned, will be learned. I think on the other hand, one thing that concerns me too, in describing the kind of Khalistan movement, I sometimes see narratives in the West, and there needs to be some learning here too. These are not a bunch of at least the Khalistan movement wasn't, from my own personal memory of it, wasn't kind of, an NGO with activists. This was a violent separatist movement. These were kind of, in some cases, designated terrorists. So while, absolutely free speech, the moment it turns into kind of violence, and as it did in, for example, against the U.S., the Indian consulate in San Francisco, I would just like to say, can you imagine if that had happened to a U.S., British, or Australian mission in India, what the reaction would have been, and what was the expectation would have been? So I do think on that side, I think there needs to be some looking back at what the, not just remembering in India, not to play politics with the kind of separatism, but even abroad, in terms of that this was a serious problem that India faced, and that it should not be just dismissed as, oh, these are people who are just harmless at the end of the day.
And I would add to that, to agree with Tanvi that, I think particularly in the media, right? I think there are elements of the media in the West that sort of tend to portray some of these extremely dodgy characters, right? I mean, this is like pretty vicious people who are like, threatening to blow up airlines and so on, things as just some kind of, cuddly free speech advocate. And I think that there's sort of, you can be critical of the Indian government's alleged policies, and you can also not necessarily be sympathetic to some of these characters.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
So, Tanvi, I alluded to earlier Jake Sullivan's meetings in Delhi this week. He met with his counterpart, Ajit Doval, the External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, as well as Prime Minister Modi. What do you think the significance of this meeting was? What chatter are you picking up? It of course wasn't, a visit with a lot of pomp and circumstance, but I think the fact that it took place so closely after an election was clearly noted. Did you glean anything of interest from this?
I think one that, it finally happened. This was a trip that Jake Sullivan had been planning twice. I think, was the third attempt. Third time lucky. The Middle East stayed calm for, 5 minutes to allow this to happen. To me, actually, it also came on the heels of a pull aside with President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, and a hug. Of course, we have to mention the hugs.
The Pope hug was more impressive, though.
Sorry?
The Pope hug was more impressive.
The Pope hug was more impressive, and already apparently been deployed in election campaigns somewhere. But just going back to U.S. India, I actually think, the chatter you hear, especially, in the media sometimes, is kind of a relationship that is dying, that is kind of gone off tracks, that has not been moving. And to me, when you actually start reading some of these, I know for many people, boring fact sheets, but, boring people like me actually go over them. Whether you look at the fact sheet and the breadth and depth of working level cooperation, on defense, on space, on technology across the board. I think the way they put it was kind of on innovation, production, and deployment across a range of domains. On critical minerals, talking about joint investments in South America and Africa. Even kind of multilateral cooperation in places you'd never see it earlier, whether that is, the Quad ambassadors coming together in kind of Geneva to push forward certain initiatives at, I think it was the World Health Assembly meeting, or the Maritime Security Group meeting, the U.S., India participating in, the Indian military participating in red flag exercises, and even things we didn't know about but gets stuffed into these fact sheets, like India taking part in a U.S.-India space tabletop exercise, and then participating in, something the Space Command does as an observer, which is mostly U.S. and allies. To me, I mention all these things to partly say we are actually now seeing a U.S.-India relationship that is functioning a lot like normal U.S. relationships, which is, it doesn't just require the big summit. And if that's all you focus on, you miss that it is still moving forward. I'm not denying that, it's going to be a year where keeping momentum going with 2 elections is not going to be, it has not been easy. You need kind of those action forcing events. But to me, you're really seeing in these kind of meetings the breadth and depth of cooperation, and how much across a range of activities the two sides have become not indispensable. I leave those kind of exaggerated things for politicians to use, but very important to each other's objectives. And to me, Jake Sullivan's visit at a time that, he's got a lot on his plate, the Prime Minister has other things going on, the Prime Minister chose to meet with him as well, sending a signal. I think, it tells you a lot, and not just Jake Sullivan visiting Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, and side by side, there's a major congressional delegation in India.
So, Sadanand, let me just kind of pivot to our third topic, which is the economy. There's been a lot of talk in recent days about coalition politics and whether, the absence of a party with a clear parliamentary majority is going to be detrimental to economic reforms and I think to governance more generally. You've been a critic at times of the Modi government's economic record. Do you think this election moves the needle in any direction, more positive or more negative?
Well, a couple of things, right? I mean, first of all, the Modi government over the last 10 years, I don't think anyone could reasonably say that this has been a dramatically reformist government, even when it did enjoy a single party majority of its own. This is not to say that they haven't done some good things, right? The infrastructure build out, particularly roads, ports, airports, that has been impressive. They have, in general, been fiscally responsible, despite the fact that the BJP does depend to a large extent on its own giving people handouts and so on. It's sort of been done in a responsible way. They've turned around the health of the public sector banks, which is again a big achievement. They've been pretty good, I think, on the whole in attracting FDI. I think the jury's still out on the production-linked incentive scheme. But to answer your question more directly, Milan, I don't see policy changing dramatically, right? So it's not as though these guys were dramatic, free market reformers over the last 10 years, and now suddenly they won't be that, right? They have a certain view. They think India needs a combination of high tariffs and production-linked incentives and better infrastructure. And they want to showcase a few big projects, things like Apple making iPhones. They want to attract Tesla, and they hope that that's going to catalyze more manufacturing. I don't see how having 240 seats changes any of that. I think the broad thrust of that policy, to my mind, is going to remain the same, as also, having a role for Indian business in all of this, particularly this, 4 or 5 large business groups that they seem to be betting on. The thing I worry about a little bit, though, is that if they draw the wrong lesson from this election, if the lesson they draw is that the Congress party's, to my mind, rather irresponsible promises are the way to go, that you have to sort of, forget fiscal restraint, let's get some cut cash going, and and not to mention some of the other batty ideas that have been touted by Congress, including a wealth survey linked to cost survey and so on. If that happens, I think then there would be a setback for India, a setback for economic reforms and how the economy is viewed outside of India. But if they maintain the ship steadily the way they have, I don't think it's dramatically reformist, but I think a lot of businesses and a lot of investors have a certain comfort level with that. And so you probably continue to see, a steady upward trajectory, even if it doesn't grow as fast as some of us would have liked.
Tanvi, let me just kind of pick up on this lessons issue, because to the extent that the Indian voter is frustrated by the state of the economy, and, they said they were frustrated by issues of price rise, unemployment, livelihoods, how do you see this government responding, particularly on the trade front, right? Because I think there have been a lot of people who have been encouraging them to move away from their more protectionist instincts. But you could see one response to this be, well, we're actually going to double down on nativism because we have to do more manufacturing and more indigenization and more import substitution.
I think, one of the things, and I agree with Sadanand here, the jury is out. We will find out what, over time, what they think the lessons learned are. But if the message is jobs, 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 as some have said, that people are saying to them, we like the welfare programs you've set up and the systems, yes, but we want jobs. We want, our own livelihoods. Then you need more investment, both domestic and foreign. And so if that's the case, you will at the very least not want to make moves that would dissuade that foreign investment. At the same time, of course, I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing them pressing domestic business in. They haven't been investing. It's mostly been, public investment. So, also pressure or persuasion on the kind of Indian private sector itself. But they will want to attract foreign investment. And for that, we've heard again and again what foreign investors want. They want more certainty. They want, also a policy that says not just imports or exports good, imports bad, but an ability to just have kind of more, I wouldn't say, liberalized trade regime as such, but I guess, one way that they would find it easier to make India part of their supply chains by bringing in components, etc., or by, creating jobs on the ground and bringing investment in, setting up factories of different sizes. So I think, and then not just setting up factories of different sizes, but ecosystems as well. So, if the idea is you want to create jobs, that's not going to come from pressing reverse or rewind on kind of economic policy, right? Going back. So the question, though, I think is what Sadanand pointed out. Do they become more politically cautious? They've got state elections coming up in a number of places where they will be on defense. And so the question is, do they decide we're going to be more cautious? I think on trade, we might see much more kind of specific areas. So in some areas, they might actually rationalize import tariffs. We had got some indication before from some of the kind of bureaucrats saying, this government, when it comes back in, is not going to look at import duties as a revenue source anymore. Now, I don't know if that changes given the coalition government aspect, but I do think, we might see in some areas, yes, import duties come down, but in other areas, it might be tougher for them, for example, given some of the things we heard from on the agricultural side, that agricultural market access might be tougher in terms of negotiations. Always tough, but it might be even tougher for them as they're negotiating some of these economic agreements with different countries. Now, I would like that they actually think, okay, we'll give some to get our farmers to have more access in other places, as there has been the case, for example, in I think even the Australia Economic Cooperation Agreement. But again, that is my lessons learned. That might not be their lessons learned.
Sadanand, let me ask you about an issue that is partially economic in nature, which is reservations, because, one of the things that the BJP's Char So Par 400-seat rhetoric opened them up to was this charge that they wanted to dramatically change the Constitution. And the opposition really used that to scare people into thinking that they were going to take away reservation. Now, the BJP has not said in its manifesto it aims to take away reservation. I don't think they would have taken away reservation even if they got 400 seats. But that was sort of out there in the ether. And I do think it had, some explanatory effect if you look at, for instance, Dalit moves against the BJP. How do we think about this, right? Because the Congress blamed the BJP for making stuff up based on stuff they didn't say in the manifesto. But it seems like the Congress essentially was doing the same. Is that fair? I've talked to some people who said, well, when you talk about changing the Constitution in North India, in places where Ambedkar is so revered, it has a certain connotation. It doesn't have to be spelled out in the manifesto. Is this fair game or not?
Well, I think the parallel you draw is absolutely correct, right? In both cases, the BJP constructed an idea of what Congress was saying. It wasn't based on what Congress actually said, but they made a plausible case based on interpretation. And I think that's what Congress was doing too. My own view is that it was never on the cards. I think there's such a central tenet of the RSS and the Sangh Parivar, which is that the primary goal is to unite all strata of Hindu society, and that universal adult franchise and reservations, at least in the last few decades, maybe not in the 1950s so much, are simply cornerstones of this project. And there is, are there elements in Indian society who are sympathetic to Hindu nationalism, who bemoan reservations and blame many of India's ills on reservations? For sure. But is that something that is reflective of, the BJP's priorities or policies as a party? Not by any stretch, right? So I think this was clever politics. The Congress sort of exploited this, but I don't think it was ever on the cards. I think the larger question for India here really is that, how do you as a society, how do you deal with inequality of outcomes, right? And one way to look at it is that to a certain degree, inequality of outcomes are just going to be inevitable, particularly as India becomes a more, market-based economy. And that the best that India can do is provide some kind of safety net to make sure that the people at the bottom don't really, don't suffer inordinately or don't fall below a threshold. And then you have the opposite view, which I think is fairly summarizes the Congress view, which is much more to focus on any inequality and ascribe some kind of discrimination to that. And I happen to think that that's not a very constructive way to think about these things in any society. But there's no question that it works. And so the BJP finds that, its own kind of appeal to primordialism in the shape of, Hindu unity against Muslims or people is now being matched by the Congress brand of primordialism, which is a kind of, socialism plus Lohiaism, where everything is going to be, viewed through the prism of alleged upper caste oppression of lower caste. So very, very interesting times.
So, Tanvi, I just want you and I to both reflect on how diplomatic that was, because I was recalling that Sadanand's previous column prior to the election results coming out was called Venezuela on the Ganga, which I think referred to what would happen if the Congress party actually won the elections.
We're a good influence on him.
This is a family channel.
So before I let you both go, we are headed into what is already feels like a very long, hot summer, certainly for our India listeners. But I want to ask you, and Tanvi, maybe I'll start with you, is there a storyline or something, a milestone perhaps, related to India that you're going to be following that, as the heat of the summer drones on, that our listeners should be paying attention to as well?
Two, I'll do it very quickly. One is on China. And the question is, what do we see in India-China relations in the next few months? There's been a lot of talk, there was a lot of chatter before, that there will be, some effort at dialogue now that the elections are over. There've been a number of calls from some of the China hands in India that this is a good time to stabilize relations, set a floor, as the US and Australia have done. And there's some chatter that in July, when there's an SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, that there'll be some pull aside. But, one of the things is, what does China read from this elections? Do they see a weaker Modi that they can pressure or persuade to make concessions in some way? Or do they pressure him at the negotiating table or even at the border? So something I'm watching quite closely is what happens in India-China relations. The second one, and Sadan's not going to laugh again, is how my hometown reacts to the new kind of the new India of this coalition government. And I said Sadan's going to laugh because I'm going to put this in international relations terms. Delhi is a city that revolves around power, and there has been a shift in the balance of power. It might not have been as dramatic as some might have hoped, but it is a shift. And how do various actors and institutions adjust to this new reality? Do they gravitate towards, do they say we're now in a multipolar world again, we need to kind of hedge our bets, we need to balance instead of bandwagoning as they have in the last few years? Or how do they move? And what does the BJP do and this government do to potentially restore that balance of power in their favor? So that's the other thing I'm watching.
Stalin, what about you?
So, I'm kind of fascinated by this YouTuber Dhruv Rathi, right? Young guy, was born in Haryana or from a family in Haryana, then went to Germany to study. And became, I think by many accounts, became actually a force in this particular election. And I think it's an interesting thing to follow for a couple of reasons. First is that I think he is undoubtedly at this moment in time the single most effective critic that the BJP has, certainly outside of formal politics. And he's also someone who it is very difficult for, their IT cell and so on to kind of caricature, right? He can't be caricatured as a con market gang or a Macaulayite or anything else, because he's obviously a person from, largely a Hindi-speaking background from a northern Indian state, who has become very successful and has a large following in part because of the sort of the arc of his life, right? That he comes from not a particularly privileged background and has become this huge YouTuber who flies around the world to safari parks and all kinds of things. So if the BJP tries to look for ways in which to clamp down on YouTube or influencers, I'll be looking at this, because then it means that the lesson that they have drawn from this election is that you can't really allow too much criticism. Like whatever little criticism was allowed, which is basically in the online space, that needs to be shut down also. Alternatively, if they don't, then you could sort of think that their lesson that they've drawn is that, look, many voters were actually put off by what they saw as kind of creeping authoritarianism, and it makes more sense to tread more gently and not try to quash these kinds of figures. So to me, that'll be one very interesting and important sign of what lessons exactly the unipolar hegemon and those around him have drawn.
Although, there is a kind of third way there, right? Which is, we were discussing this offline, which is, the Information and Broadcasting Ministry has moved to regulate user-generated content on social media through the typical kind of, labyrinthine ways of the IAS and the bureaucracy. And so that may be a way to stymie people like Dhruv Rathi, but without doing so with a blunt force kind of instrument.
Yeah, but people will notice, right? The thing is that if they suddenly can't access a Dhruv Rathi video where he's being deeply critical of the government or the prime minister, people will notice, and in a way that they wouldn't really notice or particularly care, if you go after some academic in London or whatever.
So the thing that I'm going to be watching, and I think we will get some news on this as early as next week, is who is going to be the next speaker of the Lok Sabha. And it's a curious thing because nobody has really ever cared who the speaker was. If you think about Om Birla, the last speaker, or Meera Kumar, they weren't particularly noteworthy in terms of their role as speakers. But the speaker is the only person that matters when it comes to the adjudication of the anti-defection law, which is very pertinent here because you have a dominant party in the BJP that relies on its allies, and allies which are clearly scared that they could use this law, or I should say the workarounds around this law, to break the TDP and the JDU, in particular, but maybe others as well. And so the media has suggested that the TDP has been making a play for one of the allies to hold the speakership. The India Alliance has come out to say that we will support an alliance candidate if somebody who's not from the BJP comes forward. So this is something that I think on June 22nd or 23rd we will hear, but it's something I'm paying attention to as part of a larger piece of work that I've been doing on defections. I think we've kind of lost sight of how central this law, or the workarounds of this law, have become. So something to stay tuned for. Sadanand Dhume, AEI, and Wall Street Journal, Tanvi, Madan, and Brookings, it is always a pleasure to have you guys on. It's been far too long. Thank you so much for taking the time.
For having us.
Thanks, Milan.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.